study that I'm going to present next week deals with an analysis of the efficacy and safety of Ponatinib, the third generation BCR-able tyrosine kinase inhibitors in patients in chronic myeloid leukemia in chronic phase who have failed after one or more second generation TKIs. And the failure could be either from toxicity or from resistance. And what I'll show is that even when the patients are resistant to a second generation TKI, they respond very effectively to Ponatinib. So the study analyzed two populations. The first one is an older study called the PACE trial. And the PACE trial has recruited patients who were in chronic phase chronic myeloid leukemia or Philadelphia positive ALL, and who had either resistance or intolerance to the second generation tyrosine kinase inhibitors. And there were 254 patients enrolled in the study. In our analysis, we looked only at the patients who had chronic phase CML. And that was about, ultimately, it was 257 patients. Now, the second study is called the Optic Trial. So the Optic Trial had 3 arms. With a starting dose of Ponatinib 45 or 30 or 15 milligrams. To be able to compare the Optic to the PACE, we only analyzed the arm where the patient started with 45 milligrams, and then once they had a good response, they were reduced to 15 milligrams. So there were 93 patients in that arm of the study. So the total analysis is about 350 patients. And this is the largest analysis of patients who have been treated with Ponatinib after failing on the treatment with second generation tyrosine kinase inhibitors. So if you look at the details of the study, the large majority of the patients, so 98% had received at least 2 second generation tyrosine kinase inhibitors, and 60% had received 3 second generation tyrosine kinase inhibitors, and 97% had resistance to at least 1 prior second generation TKI. So a very resistant population to existing therapies such as first and second generation tyrosine kinase inhibitors. So then when we look at the efficacy in the total population, and we're looking now at mature data with the 2-year outcome, what we found is that the incidence of complete cytogenetic response, or PCR, of 1% or less at 24 months was 46% on the PACE and 52% on the Optic Trial. So in essence, the same efficacy on both trials, even though on the Optic, we used the Ponatinib for 45 milligrams for a determined period of time until we get the PCR to low levels, and then we change. Most importantly, when we look at the 2-year survival, the 2-year survival on the PACE was 85%, and on the Optic, it's 93%. This is an amazing 2-year survival rate because these patients have failed essentially the second generation TKIs, and they were resistant to that. And yet, after 2 years on the treatment, over 90% of the patients are alive. Then we did the subset analysis looking at whether the patients were exposed to 1 prior second generation TKI or 2 or more, and the data remains the same, essentially favoring the dose-adjusted approach. And the data was similar also by the baseline mutations. So in each of the subset analysis, it appears that the Optic Trial, which starts with Ponatinib 45 milligrams and then reduces it to 15 milligrams a day after achieving a PCR level of 1% or less, did better, at least equally or better. And then finally, we looked at the safety data because that's the major concern with Ponatinib. And when we look at the safety data, we find that the incidence of arterial occlusive events, which is the most worrisome problem with Ponatinib, decreased from 16% on the PACE to 3% on the Optic Trial. And when we did also adjudication for the arterial occlusive events in the first and second year, the incidence was much less with the regimen where we adjusted the dose schedule after achieving a good response. So in essence, this analysis confirms that Ponatinib is an extremely powerful and beneficial drug in patients with chronic phase CML who have failed second-generation TKI, even though they may be resistant. We confirmed that their cytogenetic response rate is very high. The 2-year estimated survival is close to 90%. And then most importantly, when we adjust the dose from 45 to 15 milligrams after we achieve a good response, the incidence of vaso-occlusive events or arterio-occlusive events becomes very low, in essence confirming that the drug is also reasonably safe when we use this strategy of adjusting the dose. But this study is very important for patients who fail a second-generation TKI, and that number of patients is becoming increasingly larger. And there is the fear in the community practice that Ponatinib at the dose that was approved by the FDA, which is 45 milligrams a day, could be toxic. So this analysis reassures the physicians and the patients that if we dose adjust the drug once the patients have a good response, then they can receive a very effective drug and it would be safe with the dose adjustment. Also, it is very important in Philadelphia positive ALL. This is a different disease where we're using Ponatinib, and it appears that Ponatinib is vastly superior to the other tyrosine kinase inhibitors, either when we combine it with chemotherapy or with the antibodies. So this reassures us again that for the entity of Philadelphia positive ALL, Ponatinib can be a very powerful, actually the best BCR-ABL kinase inhibitor in my opinion, and it can be delivered safely if we reduce the dose once we have a good response.